And we'll, of course, wrap up 2 Samuel as we kind of work our way through this. We looked last week at chapter 7. Samuel begins to judge Israel. Today we're going to look at 8 and 9 together, although if you're taking notes in your Bible, I'd probably encourage you to bracket together 8, 9, and 10. They really all three go together. That is more than we could, even at our very best pace, could ever get through in one night, certainly in one reasonable setting. So I kind of looked through it and decided that 10 probably more easily stood alone than 9, because 8 and 9, 10 is when Saul actually gets appointed as king. Chapter 8, we're going to look, this is really kind of in a sense, a crescendo moment. Remember, this is right at the very end of the period of the judges. That'll come up again tonight. Samuel is really the last official judge, and I phrase it that way because you'll see in a moment, as great as Samuel was, and we almost exclusively have great things about Samuel. We're going to look here in a moment at one thing he does that didn't go over quite as well. He's going to appoint his sons to be judges, and his, again, as great as Samuel was, and we sort of criticized Eli for the same thing, although I don't think this is to the same degree, but his sons, we're told, are a problem also, and just the challenge of raising up, godly children, and especially men that will ultimately become leadership in the nation of Israel. So he tries to put his sons in charge because Samuel's now really old, and all of the elders of the tribe of Israel come together and basically say, no, we don't want it. And that partially, I think, is because they kind of acquiesced to the idea of the judges for a long time. But you remember, way back, what did they ask for? They've been asking for a king for a long time, and God kind of kicked that can down the road. Although we'll look in Deuteronomy, he's already told them, if and when you get to this point, here's what the king should look like. He should follow after me, and he should be from inside. Don't put a foreigner as king, and all kinds of things like that. But there's a reason why being a king is very different than the setup of a judge. You're going to look at that. The role of a judge is to do exactly what it sounds like, to guide the nation of Israel, but they've got a job that really is expected to end with them, right? Being a judge, as best as we can figure it, was never intended to be passed down in terms of a lineage. Kings, on the other hand, are, as you know, very different. They are intended to be generational. So when you pick a king, that's very different than a judge being appointed. You've got a judge goes south, that really lasts the duration of his or her life. A king starts to get a little different. So we're going to look at that, but we'll do 8 and 9 together. All right, let's read this. We'll do it like we did the last few weeks. We'll read down through a few verses at a time. We'll kind of comment as we go. We're not going to read all of this. We'll read most of 8. But 9 is longer, so from about verse 3 down through about verse 14 of chapter 9, we're not going to read that. We'll summarize that just to kind of move us along. All right, 1 Samuel chapter 8. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. Now, is there anything inherently wrong with Samuel appointing judges? Well, yes and no. You think back to the period of the judges, God appointed these people to be judges, and he intended this to be for a very particular time and space, and he appointed certain people to do this with the ultimate understanding that they still have God as king. That was his ultimate hope. So again, there have been times where God has allowed a judge to be appointed by men over local areas. Moses did this, but that wasn't the nation of Israel like these judges had prerogative to do. And we get the sense that Samuel was appointing essentially his replacement, which was, it's not like this in Scripture, but if you think of judges like Big J, Little J are local judges that dealt with small local affairs. Judges, as God appointed them, dealt with the whole nation of Israel. Sometimes prophetically, sometimes they just dealt with the nation, but that was a much larger role. We get the sense that Samuel was wanting to appoint his sons. Again, the Big J, Little J thing is a Keaton thing, not a textual thing. But he wanted them to be his replacement. Judges, not local judges. And we're going to look at that in a minute. Again, Samuel's getting older, and by all accounts, Samuel lives a tremendous life. Don't let this next little bit sully that opinion. But this is a little bit out of norm here. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the second was Abijah, and they were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons, now notice this, and again, such a warning to us. Again, Samuel's one of the good ones. By all accounts, Samuel's one of the good ones. I mean, he was dedicated to God as a child. He lived all of his life. Even during some of those periods where we don't have any text, we get the sense that Samuel was trying to pull God's people back when it was, to say unpopular is an understatement. But let's look what the text points us to. Yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and they perverted justice. We don't get a lot of editorialization as to, Samuel's parenting philosophy, but it is a good reminder that personal godliness, right? And we know, we talked about it in our parenting class this morning, being good Christians, following after God is not a guarantee recipe to get your kids there. Right? I mean, that's a good start. You have to have that. But training your children is another thing entirely. To have personal faith and passing that faith on in a way that makes them want to follow it too are two very different things. And we see many examples of good, godly men. Again, I think Samuel's a great one, where we see his children didn't follow after that. Again, we know almost nothing about the way he raised his children. But it is a good reminder that great people have come before us, following after God, and children have went astray for a variety of reasons. But that's the condition of his kids, right? His sons did not walk in his ways, Samuel's ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and they perverted justice. Again, Samuel, as far as I can tell, was not in a position to appoint his sons judges over Israel, to the degree that had that been what God had wanted, when we look at records of the judges, Old and New Testament, his sons' names aren't there, right? Samuel is really considered to be the last of the God-approved, God-appointed judges. This just didn't fly. And again, we get a sense that he did appoint his sons judges for a time, but very quickly, even as quickly as verse 4, then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. Now, again, they had every right to do this for a couple reasons. One, as great as Samuel was, again, didn't have the authority to appoint his sons judges. But as you could guess, the bigger problem is these are men, his sons, these are men that aren't following after God, right? So Israel as a whole is not super tight at the moment. They're not their strongest, but they still recognize the need for a leader. And that, again, we're going to kind of have to build this profile together, because in spite of the fact that they don't want ungodly men in the form of Samuel's sons, what are they going to continue beating down the door to try to get? They're going to want a king. And they're going to, and this is a great reminder, when we ask, sometimes we need to be careful what we ask for, right? We'll look in the text. Why did they want a king? Not because of any practical reason. They said, we want a king because we want to be like everybody else, right? Let's read this together. Verse 4. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, behold, you are old and your sons do not walk in your ways. So again, Israel's kind of pulling away from God at this point, but good on them for recognizing your sons are not the solution. They may not have seen, the plank in their eye, so to speak, but they recognize that these guys aren't the ones that are going to lead them into the promised land, so to speak. They say, you're getting older, right? Very frank assessment. You're old, and your sons don't walk in your ways. Now, appoint for us a king to judge us like all other nations. Verse 6 is really poignant, I think. I think we get a little glimpse into Samuel. The thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. we get kind of a twofold here, because I think we can infer in the text Samuel is hurt because his sons are rejected, right? I mean, I don't know how we could read into this and not get the sense that he's at least in part hurt because his two sons aren't approved to take the baton, so to speak. But what's interesting is, what does he do with that frustration and that hurt? I mean, we have plenty of examples of people scorned less than this that just go off on a warpath, right? And really tank the nation of Israel, tank God's people at various points. Samuel, again, he's one of the good ones. In spite of some chinks in the armor, he's one of the good ones. Samuel prayed to the Lord. All the elders got together. You know, again, I don't know that in and of itself the desire to have a king was bad. Again, go to, if you want to look at Deuteronomy 17, God knew one day that Israel would have a king. God knew this and already had told the nation of Israel, when that time comes, here's going to be the parameters for it. Deuteronomy 17, starting about verse 14 through about verse 20, gives them some instructions on that. So God knows that this is coming. But I want us to make the distinction here between God's timing and our timing. Right? The nation of Israel is going to push. Give us a king, give us a king. We want to be like everybody else. And God says, fine, if you put my feet to the fire, you want a king that's going to look like everybody else? I'll give you a king that's going to want to fraternize with everybody else. I'm going to give you exactly what you ask for in King Saul. Now, Saul's going to have a lot of military victories. It's not that Saul did everything wrong. Saul's going to continue to give them some more independence from the nation, from the Philistines and things like this. But when you and I think of Saul as king, we think of Saul as king. He is a selfish king. I mean, that's probably the adjective I would think of first. But the irony, I think, is had they done it on God's time. Because again, they've been asking for, Deuteronomy 17 is 400 years before this. So in the big scope of history, not that long ago. And God's saying, if you'll just wait on my timing. Because God, again, knows what's coming, and who is he preparing all in the wait? He's got David waiting and waiting, but it has to happen at God's time. The irony of, if they had just waited, God was already preparing a king. God was preparing David, but they're going to get the king that they ask for. Again, they wanted a king like all other nations. This isn't a reason at all. Really, this is peer pressure, if anything. Romans 12 talks to us about that, right? Be transformed. Don't allow the outside pressures to influence everything that you want. Be transformed into the image of Christ. Again, there was a difference between a king and a judge. A judge, by its definition, was a leader that was raised up by God, usually to meet a specific need in a time, usually in crisis. And when that crisis was over, usually the judge went back to their normal life. But a king created a lineage. A king created a whole nother office entirely. Kings establish government, which can be, as Israel's about to find out, both a blessing and a curse. And they're wanting to do it on their own timing. Again, go back to Judges 8, right? Gideon was offered to be king. They said, be our king, right? But he refused. He said, I will not rule over you, nor will my sons rule over you. And notice his reason, Judges 8:23, the Lord shall rule over you. Gideon got it. It wasn't so much that the role of king was going to be the problem, but it was, why do you want a king, and who's going to be that guy? Who's going to have that lineage that's ultimately going to take that leadership role and condense all of it down to what is God's will here, not mine. And friends, you and I both know this. This is still true in our day. It takes a unique man or woman to take the pomp and the circumstance and the power and the prestige of leadership and be able to stifle all that and keep at the very top, what does God ask of me? Again, that's a tough role even today. But we're going to look at how Samuel kind of deals with this, because all in this chapter 8 and chapter 9. In chapter 9, Samuel and Saul are going to come face to face, right? God's going to utilize some donkeys to connect them together, and we're going to see. But look at Samuel's prayer, starting in verse 6. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Obey the voice of the people in that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they've rejected me from being king over them." You almost hear in there God comforting Samuel. Again, I think that's what kind of infers to us some of Samuel's hurt. What displeased Samuel was not just we want a king, but it was my sons are being rejected, right? Because God comforts him here, right? It's not they're just rejecting you, Samuel, or your sons. They're rejecting me. At the core of it, they're rejecting me. Go to verse 8. According to all the deeds that they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so that they also are doing to you. Now then, obey their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. And that's what Samuel's about to do. Samuel's about to go in and remind Israel in no uncertain language what's coming. And you've read this story, right? He's going to warn them, and we'll read this together, 10 through verse 18. He's going to tell them, He's going to take your daughters. He is going to take the best of your fields. He's going to take a tenth of your grain. He's going to take your servants. He's going to take your donkeys. He's going to take your flocks. He's going to take your slaves. He's going to take everything. And you would think that the common sense would kick in over that. But of course, they continue to cry out, "Give us a king." Don't ever underestimate the power of wanting to fit in. Again, Samuel, prophetically from God, is telling them, bad things are coming. Give us a king. We want to be like everybody else. So God says, okay, we're going to give you a king, and you're going to learn the hard way. Listen to these words, 10 down through verse 18. He tells Samuel to warn the nation. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king. He said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you." So specific. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers, and he will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He will take a tenth of your grain and your vineyards and give it to his officers and his servants. He will take your male servants and your female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys, and he'll put them to work. He'll take a tenth of your flocks, and you shall, listen to this, you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because your king, whom you have chosen for yourself, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. And listen to the response in verse 19. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, "No, but there shall be a king over us." You know, sometimes we think right and wrong should be that simple. It should be so obvious what decisions we should make. But friends, let's not fool ourselves into thinking that we can't be tempted, whether it be by peer pressure, whether it be by whatever, you fill in the blank, to make wrong choices, even in the midst of good information. That's exactly what they had. They had as accurate information as humanly possible from God himself, prophetically from God, telling them, this is not hypothetical, this is what's coming. And they say, be that as it may, but there will be a king. In spite of all that, there will be a king. That we also, this is verse 20, again, come back to why. I think that's the whole purpose of these couple chapters. Why? Was it that God inherently hated the time of the kings or hated the idea of a king? Because they're about to enter the period of the kings where there's going to be some great kings, starting with King David. I don't know that that's the problem. What is the motive behind it? Even after hearing all this, but they said, but we're going to have a king. We're going to look like everyone else, that we may also be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And when Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey their voice and make them a king. And Samuel said to the men of Israel, go every man to his city. We jump down into chapter 9, and again, if we had lots of time, we'd dwell on that a little bit more. But again, God gives them fair warning. So when we keep going and we start reading more and more and more about what King Saul does or doesn't do, we're tempted to feel sorry for Israel. I don't feel super sorry. God warned them over and over and over and over, and they said no. So go into chapter 9. So now, we're going to read just a few verses just to kind of speed us through here. So there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish. Then we get this genealogy that doesn't so much matter for the sake of our time. But his father, Kish, was a man of wealth. Now go to verse 2. That's where we really want to spend our time. He had a son whose name was Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders up, he was taller than any of the people. I want you to think for a second, what do you not hear in this description of Saul? I want you to think in your mind's eye, we're by all earthly accounts, and we get some great verses coming in the book of Samuel about, right, when we're going to get to the time of David and they're going to say, hey, look at all of the sons. Not David, he's going to say, but God cares about what's on the inside, not on the out. But from the outside, does Saul not sound like the king? Right? He's head and shoulders above every other man. Right? He is the most handsome in all of Israel. But what's not here? He's wealthy, he's good looking, he's physically the part. When we get a description of Saul, there is nothing about his character, about his relationship to God, most importantly. And that's going to be ultimately the downfall. There's nothing said about how he connects to God. You know, Saul reflected, I think, the spiritual state of Israel. Right? I think in a lot of ways, King Saul, being appointed as the first king, is really a metaphor to Israel's spiritual condition. They looked the part, they were willing to go through the motions, but on the inside, they were as shallow could be. Right, they didn't want to put in the work. And that's going to be Saul's, Achilles heel over and over again, right? He wants to follow God to a point, but then his desires kick in. And you and I can empathize with that, I think. Right? I mean, that is the struggle we face every day of how willing am I to push past my discomfort to do the will of God. David, not a perfect man. Some of the most famous stories we know of David are in response to his disobedience. But David was willing to dig and push when it felt uncomfortable, and God rewarded him because of it. So 3 through verse 14. Again, this is Saul and his servants are going to search for some of his father Kish's donkeys, and they're going to meet Samuel along the way. We don't have time to read all that. Just 3 through 14, read that at home. But again, they're trying to find these donkeys. And again, the irony of God utilizing this to connect them together, to connect Saul and Samuel. But let's pick up in verse 15. Now, the day before Saul came, the Lord had revealed to Samuel, tomorrow, about this time, I will send to you a man from the land of Benjamin, and you shall appoint him to be prince over my people Israel. He shall save my people from the hand of the Philistines, for I have seen my people, because their cry has come to me. When Samuel saw Saul, the Lord told him, here is the man of whom I spoke to you. He it is who shall restrain my people. And then Saul approached Samuel in the gate and said, tell me, where is the house of the seer? And Samuel answered Saul, I am the seer. Go up before me in the high place, for today you shall eat with me. And in the morning I will let you go and tell you all that is on your mind. As for your donkeys that were lost 3 days ago, do not set your mind on them, for they have been found. And for whom is all that is desirable in Israel? Is it not for you and for your father's house? Now, again, why did Samuel go through all of this? Again, some of it is to prove to Saul that he is who he says he is, right? He's going to tell him, to give him a little bit of an inkling here, right? He's going to say, you're going to come eat with me today. Saul had to have been amazed, right? Put yourself in his shoes. He's been looking for this prophet, and the first man he asked was the man that he's been looking for, invited him to come to dinner, and then ultimately he told him, hey, the donkeys you've been looking for, right? The only way Samuel could have known about that was had he really been a man of God that was sent here for this reason. He says, don't worry about the donkeys, right? They've already been found. Samuel's proving to Saul that he was a true prophet of God. He showed Saul that he knew things that only God could have offered him. Let's jump down and read 22 through 24. Samuel took Saul and his young men and brought them into the hall and gave them a place at the head of those who had been invited, who were about 30 persons. And Samuel said to the cook, bring the portion I gave you of which I said, put it aside. And so the cook took up the leg and what was on it, and he set them before Saul. And Samuel said, see, what was kept is set before you. Eat, because it was kept for you until the appointed hour, that you might eat with the guests. And Saul ate with Samuel that day. And when they came down from the high place into the city, a bed was spread for Saul on the roof, and he lay down to sleep. And at the break of dawn, Samuel called to Saul on the roof, up, that I may send you on your way. So Saul arose, and he and Samuel went out into the street. And when they were going down to the outskirts of the city, Samuel said to Saul, tell the servant to pass on before us, and when he is passed, stop here yourself for a while, that I may make known to you the word of God. The ending of this, before Saul's going to be appointed king, Samuel wants Saul to know explicitly, you need to understand why you're here. You need to understand who, if you want any chance to succeed, you have to understand who's really in charge. And here's the interesting thing about Saul. Saul starts out positive, right? You look at the reign of King Saul, it starts out really good. There's probably a lesson in here about spiritual perseverance, right? That starting strong is great, but there's something to be said for how do we end, right? I mean, Jesus parables this often in the New Testament, but he's going to explain to Saul over and over, this is who you belong to. This is who has placed you here. And Saul takes that seriously at first, but like many of us still, we struggle with the idea. Eventually, we kind of grow accustomed to this idea of, I'm important, right? I'm the reason I'm here. Saul's going to have some military victories that had not been seen for a long time in Israel's history. So he's going to begin to think, hey, look at me. And then ultimately, all the while, God is going to be preparing somebody else. Remember, he gave them their king. Saul, in many ways, is Israel's king. He represents Israel. He represents the ideology of Israel, right? Looks good on paper, but is shallow when you start really digging down. But then we're going to get to David. And David's going to be the opposite of that. Really weak on paper, but down deep is the man that God desires. And so there's a lesson in there for us. Again, we're not to King David yet, but are we Saul or are we David? Right? Do we look the part, but down deep we've got no roots to show for it? Or maybe we more like David, and probably there's some hybrid in the middle, but we'd rather be more like David, where we may not look the part, but down deep where it matters, we belong to God, and we know we belong to God. Tonight, if you aren't a Christian, we want to give you that opportunity to come and to put on Christ in baptism. Again, Samuel was not perfect, but the legacy of Samuel is a man that followed God in the good times, and when Israel was pulled away for God for 20 years, when the ark of God was sitting at someone's home just gathering dust, Samuel was preaching and teaching, come back. Samuel is a legacy of faithfulness. Tonight, if you need anything, if you'd love to put on Christ in baptism, if we can pray for you, we'd love to do that. If you come forward as we stand and as we sing together.